Good morning, everyone. Now, my books have been reviewed in lots of places, but like Amazon and Goodreads and things like that, and occult journals and things like that. But it was breathtakingly surprising that it got a review when it first came out in, of all things, the Washington Times, which is a very, very conservative uh, paper. I think it's owned by Sun Young Moon or something scary. But anyway, it got it got quite an interesting and very positive review, uh, and even a big picture of Constance and me on the cover. A story told by Jesus's uncle. So I appreciate it, uh, but it is surprising. Today we're going to meet John the Baptist. We're going to finish up chapter 1 and begin and read chapter 2 in its entirety, which is a very short chapter. Again, we are reading Accidental Christ, and this is the best, most economic, and if you're on Kindle Deluxe or whatever it is, it's even free. Accidental Christ. The story of Jesus is told by his uncle. We're just at the beginning of this series of readings. And if you're just joining us, I really, really encourage you to scroll down to my page and watch the last couple days' very, very short excerpts, because it'll quickly bring you up to speed. And it is a novel, and it's always nice to be able to read a novel from the beginning and not jump in the middle. So this early on in our series, it's a great time for you to join us. But please scroll down and take a few minutes to view the previous two, I believe, very, very short readings. Soon after Theodos's bungling revelation, Jesus was returned to the land of his birth. However, he would not go to Judea, which was too politically charged to be safe, but to Nazareth in Galilee, where his family had relocated. Here he was introduced for the first time to his 5 siblings, his 3 half-brothers, issued from Joseph's first marriage. Simon, 26, was married with a 9-year-old daughter. Joseph and Judas were 21 and 18 respectively. James was born 2 years after Jesus, and his only sister, Leah, a year later. They spoke Aramaic, and their provincial manners contrasted sharply with Jesus's Egyptian-esque elegance. None of the brothers made any effort to hide their resentment they felt toward Jesus. 8-year-old Leah, on the other hand, worshipped him from the moment they met. The 5 weeks he stayed at home were spent mostly in her company, telling her of life in Egypt. On the evening of his departure for this new school, she came to his room with a gift of a fresh fig. Father says you are a king, but James says it's he who is king because mother and father were not properly married when you were born. Simon says it does not matter at all, and if we tell anyone, soldiers will kill us. Are you a king? Certainly not, Jesus assured her. 3 days later, young Jesus was enrolled as a pupil at the Essene Monastery School on Mount Carmel, near the Samarian border. He would continue his studies in medicine, but no longer would he study philosophy, mathematics, and Greek. His duty now would require mastery of other subjects: Hebrew, Aramaic, and the writings of the Hebrew prophets. A king, he discovered, must fulfill the prophecies. The Carmelite Essenes differed drastically from their austere brethren in the south, and were known throughout Syria and Palestine to be the greatest healers on earth. Their most powerful weapon was the knowledge that the physical body and the mind were inseparable. Quote, "Heal the mind and the body will follow," was the first precept of Carmelite medicine. The most effective way to do this, especially when dealing with the common folk, was to personify the malady as a spirit or a demon. A skillful physician could tap the energy of the patient's own fear and superstition and turn that power upon itself to exorcise the illness. Obviously, this technique could only be successful if the original diagnosis were accurate. This discernment phase of the treatment required not only an exhaustive mastery of anatomy and medicine, but also the ability to see the spirit illness with spirit vision. The order's detractors called this diagnostic trance mystical surgery. 2 centuries of grateful patience called it miraculous. The common folk held an almost supernatural respect for Carmelite healers. So strong was their faith that very often a person who was seriously ill recovered the moment they saw the white linen robe of the physician. As impressive as the order's healing reputation was, its primary raison d'etre was nothing less than the permanent restoration of the Davidic monarchy and the priesthood of Zadok. To this end, they, more than any other sect, were the custodians of the history and central mysteries of Judaism. They possessed a magnificent library of ancient texts and employed scores of talented and disciplined scribes. Both the northern Carmelites and the Dead Sea Essenes were strict vegetarians and did not participate in animal sacrifice that was the focus of temple worship. For this reason, they were viewed with suspicion by the temple establishment from whom they had severed ties in the days of the Maccabees, and who now considered Essene philosophy too esoteric, perhaps even heretical. The Carmelites' preoccupation with the historic foundations of the faith was especially unsettling to the Levite priests, whose power was based more upon tradition than empirical history. I'm going to move that lamp for a second. It was no secret that the order's library housed original and very early copies of the Book of the Prophets. It was even rumored they possessed early drafts of Deuteronomy and other manuscripts handwritten by Ezra the scribe, which called into serious question the historical veracity of all Jewish history prior to the Babylonian captivity. Most Essenes and Therapeutae were celibate, or else observed a strict code of ritualized breeding. However, in the north, in the communities near Mount Carmel. Marriage was not forbidden. Indeed, it was encouraged. Contrary to vulgar Jewish tradition, which used the fable of Eve's temptation of Adam to demonize the female's spiritual status, the Carmelites revered women as the temple of God in human form, a sacred vessel worthy to house the Shekinah, the presence of the living God on earth. Being thus blessed by nature, it was deemed unnecessary, indeed deleterious, for her to undergo the same harsh disciplines and ordeals required of a man to achieve all exalted states of spiritual consciousness. Her visions, counsel, and fellowship were esteemed throughout the community. The school on Mount Carmel was strictly a male institution. Members of the lower grades were completely ignorant of the secrets and central teachings of the higher degrees. Jesus' celebrity status was known only to the abbot of the monastery, and he was required to, meaning Jesus, was required to endure the same ordeals and austerities required of any acolyte. After a 2-year probationary period, Jesus entered into the degree of faithful with a full body immersion ceremony. The next 2 degrees, illuminate and illuminated, took 2 and 3 years respectively, during which time he endured subtle tests of his loyalty and integrity. Finally, at the age of 18, 7 years after entering the school, he was formally raised to the degree of perfect master. In an elaborate 3-day entombment ceremony whereby a man is raised from death to life. Nowhere on earth was this ancient and sometimes fatal ceremony administered. Only those among the illuminated who were in the best of health and who had mastered the most profound meditative trances were eligible. No one who successfully survived the great ordeal ever feared death again. Of them it was said, "He is twice born and does not fear life, for he knows there is no dread hereafter." In the few weeks after Jesus was raised to perfect master, he became the personal apprentice to Brother Apollonius, the master physician. For the next 11 years, he labored at his side and learned the skills of medicine. For it is written, "He took upon our infirmities and carried our diseases." And now we flash back to the crucifixion scene. "He has stopped breathing. We must take him down." Jesus could hear the frantic voice of Lazar, but found it impossible to open his eyes or react. There was no reason to be alarmed, he thought. Feeling had now returned to his legs, his feet, and his legs. A delightful, soothing coolness. He stepped further into the shallows of the river. It was a hot day, and golden sunbeams walked upon the water. The dust of his long journey washed away with the slow-moving current as Jesus waded into the River Jordan toward his mad cousin, John. Chapter 2. And it has a Sumi-E beautiful painting there. Jesus was afraid of John. They first met as boys shortly after Jesus returned from Egypt, but their lives were entwined long before they were born. Both were hereditary hybrids, stars of Jewish royalty. John's mother Elizabeth was also a Benjamite and the great-aunt of Mary, the mother of Jesus. John's father, Zechariah, was the Zadokite high priest of the Temple of Jerusalem, supreme ritualistic officer of all Judaism. The marriage of Zechariah and Elizabeth was formally arranged in order to breed a David. When he was born, it was John who was secretly heralded as the King of the Jews and Messiah, and the elders scrambled to plot the scenario of his life. That all changed abruptly when it was learned that Joseph ben Heli, a wealthy widower of the house of David, had agreed to espouse a hybrid Benjamite maid, and that she was already with child. Joseph's blood ran closer to the Davidian root than did Zechariah's, and if Mary's child was a boy, his royal star would blaze brighter than John's. Contingency plans were made. If Joseph fathered a son, the child would be reared as the future king, and Zechariah's boy John would then serve as the Messiah's herald and fulfill a key prophecy of Isaiah. John was too young to remember his brief taste of kingship, but his father's disappointment remained visibly etched upon his face until he died. Still, old Zechariah was proud of his contribution and the role his seed would play. "You must be a voice which cries in the wilderness," the old man constantly reminded young John. "You will prepare the way of the Lord and make straight his way." When the word of the Messiah plot reached the ears of Herod, the elders quickly decided that it would be best for all concerned if Joseph and Mary take Jesus, the baby, and seek refuge among wealthy sympathizers in Egypt. While Jesus grew refined in the safety of Egyptian boarding schools, young John stayed in Jerusalem and steeped to manhood in a broth of bitter prophecy and Roman brutality. Unlike Jesus, he embraced his hereditary duty with a frightening passion. If he could not be king, he must be a prophet. And to that end, at the age of 16, he left the boisterous temple school, gave his possessions away, and walked into the Judean wilderness. There among the blistering stones and serpents and scorpions, he took the vow of a Nazarite. The Hebrew hero Samson had been a Nazarite, and even though his fate was an object lesson in what happens to backsliding Nazarites, he was nonetheless a revered icon of the sect. Each year, spiritually minded Jewish men seeking religious renewal took the Nazarite vow for short periods of time, 70 or 100 days. During this time, they remained celibate and wandered alone in the wilderness or otherwise kept themselves apart from the community. They fasted and shunned wine and the eating of animal flesh. More often than not, they wallowed in a background meditation of bodily mortification, during which time they allowed their hair and beards to grow. Occasionally, an aspiring holy man would take the Nazirite vow for life and become a hermit. The Judean wasteland was peppered with these mad and colorful characters. No longer answerable to any community or religious standards, their spiritual quests were entirely their own. Most preferred to begin with a year or two of complete silence, wandering the desert, eating only locusts and manna, the small hallucinogenic mushrooms that sprouted on the sand in the morning dews. Some dug holes in the sand and sat there for years. Others whipped themselves or had others do it. No holy man was truly justified until he had consigned to absolute insignificance all distractions of body and mind. Even self was abandoned in the crossing of that great mystical abyss, below which division is the result of contradiction, and above which contradiction is unity. Few aspirants ever achieve this Kabbalistic smooth point where countenance beholds countenance. Of those who did, most could not tolerate the influx of light. Their minds shattered like clay vessels struck by lightning. The temple steps were littered with these naked and babbling stillborn prophets. John gawked at them as a child. At the age of 28, the individual known as John was annihilated in the desert of Judea. Dust, lost in dust. He became the smooth point. Countenance beheld countenance. What remained of the man was a voice crying in the wilderness. What once was his duty became the unbending will of the Almighty. His personal agonies, the wrath of God. Tomorrow we'll pick up the next chapter, chapter 3. I hope you're enjoying this. Again, if you missed the first 2 or 3 very, very short ones, scroll down in the page and get caught up for tomorrow. I hope you think it will get better. Until tomorrow, continue to be good to yourself and be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will.